Welcome, Michael Voller, to Back to the City. I'm really excited about the release just last week of Tiny Circles by Jeweler. We're going to take a journey through Tiny Circles. Before taking the journey, we'll zoom in on the title and a few lyrics from the song Tiny Circles. Some patterns need to break into 1,000 little pieces. My world turns in tiny circles. This structure isn't safe. This obviously relates to the cover art of the album, which I think is really powerful. So could you begin by expanding a little bit on how those lyrics and this image, where we have 12 small circles at least, tiny circles perhaps, and one of those circles is being kind of broken into by these lines, fragments are falling into the center here in this cover art. What's the relationship between that image and those lyrics?
The artwork was made by Joe Burns. He did the majority of the work on that. He presented a number of designs that were kind of in a sketch-like format, and then we kind of fleshed them out from there. The prompt that I gave to Joe for making the artwork was 13 circles, one of them broken. We decided that, I guess over the process, that one of the circles is in the midst of being broken and the broken one is in the center. There are 13 tracks on the album. In my conceptualization of the whole piece is that each song is a circle that's been turning, or a pattern that I would like to break. Each track kind of comes to embody a cycle that I had reflected on and kind of wanted to eliminate from my life. And so that's kind of what the album as a whole is sort of about, investigating these themes and exercising them. The songs themselves were built out of these demos that I had created, which I think you even heard a long time ago. You heard a few of them. Built on my college computer. And all of them were built from these little loops. You know, I'd have like a few riffs that I would play, and I'd record it for a while, just kind of playing this, like, okay, well, here's the verse guitar part, and I'd play it for a while. I would record it and then kind of do it to like a click track so that it would loop perfectly. And so I would kind of find the best performance of that and chop it, and then I would have this loop and then kind of build the songs upon these loops. And like, okay, here's the chorus part, now it's the chorus loops, you know, and then there'd be like a keyboard part, like a drum part, lead guitar part, vocals. So I would have these different loops, which also themselves came to encompass like tiny circles.
So that's a really interesting starting point, that thematically these songs concern circular patterns that you're observing, witnessing. There's a lyric about bearing witness, not condoning them and exercising them. That's a good word, I think. Is there a significance to the double meaning of the tiny circles and the coexistence of witnessing a cycle of habits and the creation of these songs from like the looping verse part, the looping chorus part?
Not one that I had consciously considered while constructing them, but certainly that's a possibility. I had these songs and sort of had this aha moment, because I would do like a lot of journaling. And as I was journaling, I was kind of reflecting on, you know, my own life, because I would journal when I wasn't necessarily in the best mood and trying to figure out what was going on. And I came to understand that I was kind of writing about the same things over and over. And I don't know, one day I just kind of wrote that phrase down, like, my world turns in tiny circles. and everything sort of clicked. And it kind of made sense that I had been writing this album in the midst of this time, and it all kind of like came together in that moment.
Mm.
So I think there's definitely like retroactive meaning that I have applied to it, and then there's a little bit of conscious construction on what some of the songs are about and what they have. It's kind of a combination of those, but I think my subconscious was pulling the strings the whole time, or I'd like to think so anyway.
Yeah, and you were collaborating with it, with the journaling, the way in which you were describing the use of the journaling. I use journaling in a similar way. We'll definitely have more to say about the Tiny Circles when we get to that song.
Sure.
I think it's significant that it's almost the final track, but in fact we have Who's Your Flower. Do you have any initial thoughts on whether the sequencing in general of these songs is significant, and whether having Tiny Circles near but not actually at the end is significant?
There's a definite intention behind the sequencing.
Yep.
In multiple ways. I think there's a few like nods and a few winks and a few hints about things. For instance, like I think it was kind of interesting and almost pun-esque. I don't know, almost a sense of humor about it, but having like betrayal into forgiveness, I thought was kind of an interesting move to do just based on song title alone, but they actually kind of cross over into each other. A lot of it was vibe, you know, because you want to have it kind of consistently ride out in a nice way.
Yeah.
Who Is Your Flower? I kind of always knew that was going to be the last song on the album. As soon as it was kind of coming together, it just felt like it had this sort of hopefulness to it, had this interesting kind of energy to it. It kind of instrumentally mirrors the first track in this interesting way. I think like I had just gotten into playing baritone guitar when I wrote these songs. So a lot of them have my baritone guitar on them, and that the first one and the last one are both on the baritone, and it just sounds like a depressed guitar. It sounds like a regular guitar but depressed. It's just five steps lower. The baritone I play is just B to B, but I just really like how it just kind of, the whole song just kind of ends on this, just the lowest note on my baritone, just that low B, and I just liked how that felt to kind of just end it on that. But yeah, I mean, I think there's probably some lyrical themes and some other considerations that one could make, and some lines one could draw about having that song as the last song on the album. Yeah, it's like a hopeful note. It's like becoming something, a flower, I guess.
Flowers grow, yeah.
They grow, yeah. Yeah, so also I think that all of the songs exist in sort of this location, and I don't know if you recall when we talked last. It was a long time ago, but all of them kind of coexist in this like landscape, really, this like unbounded by time sort of. It's hard to describe really in words, but I'll do my best. But yeah, this kind of like non-temporal landscape where this cycle is kind of continuing and ending and starting all at once, and all of the kind of language and the like metaphors that are employed throughout the album are sort of made real and kind of exist in this place. And so Who Is Your Flower, like, I feel like is part of that place. There's like some kind of flower growing there, and it's important for some reason.
Yeah. The specific lyric, "This structure isn't safe," really. So let's just focus on that just a little bit more before we circle back to the beginning.
Yeah, sure.
If there wasn't that top left circle being broken, if all of the 12 circles on the outer rim were identical, then it would seem like a safely consistent static structure.
Mm-hmm.
But having that particular detail on the top left, initially when I saw it, seemed to kind of suggest risk and a sense that now this whole stable structure could, kind of head towards entropy now. Is the record as a whole exploring ideas related to structure and entropy?
I like that interpretation. It's not necessarily something I consciously employed or considered, but I will say that I love those ideas in general. I love things kind of decaying and breaking apart, and kind of detritus and watching like garbage disintegrate and stuff like that. That does kind of just fascinate me on some visceral level. I don't know why. I think maybe a lot of people can relate, actually, just watching things like slowly crumble away. So I've always liked those ideas, so that wouldn't surprise me if that found its way into what I was working on. And I think a touchstone sonically for this album is the landmark work by The Cure, Disintegration.
Yeah.
So that very much is an album that deals with those themes. So yeah, I think those are fair conclusions to draw about some of the stuff that's being discussed or worked upon. Yeah, and I think, there is kind of this idea of destruction at the heart of the theme of the whole thing. So yes.
Destruction, and then in the final track, especially growth, with the idea that power grows.
Yeah.
Somehow in this context.
Yeah.
So let's kind of honor the production for a moment before taking it song by song. So it was created at King Creation Studios.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this post I'm looking at here is from Elijah. Does that sound plausible?
Yeah.
Elijah Dietenberg. And Elijah shares, I started working on this record in 2018 with Michael, and it's since become my magnum opus of sorts, with layering and mixing beyond anything I've attempted prior. I can't overstate how incredibly proud of this album I am. And this single, the first single being Don't Cry For Me, gives a perfect taste of what's to come. So yeah, before diving into the individual songs, let's focus on these details, these aspects of the production, the layering and the mixing, the distinct sonic characteristics. What are they in your mind, and how do they relate, if at all, to the kind of the vision, the ethos that we've begun to discuss?
Sure thing. I actually wouldn't mind turning that question on its head and asking you the same question, if you wouldn't mind answering first, because I'm always curious to get the outside perspective on that. Absolutely. I'll give a more in-depth answer after you answer. And before I actually ask you that question, I will say that at present, I am capable of bringing myself back there and thinking about what it was that we actually did. But I got really close to this album, too close, and to the point where it's like kind of hard to see the forest for the trees. You kind of go a little bit crazy working on these things. And so I'm always so curious to hear what someone else's ear is drawn to, or what they think about those very questions. So
yeah,
if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
And then I'll say what I have to say.
Yeah, well, for one, I feel like focusing on the production could be a way of bringing together those two ways of thinking about the tiny circles that we already introduced, insofar as we have these, with layering as well in particular, that we have this kind of complex structure emerging from itself, becoming more complex. And for me, that does relate to these themes of disintegration and yearning for structure, recognizing the dangers of being comfortable with these structures as they are, celebrating and allowing some structures, like some habits, maybe good habits, to grow through the repetition and through the layering. These are some initial thoughts that I have.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's so... I worked very hard on this album, and I think it's a culmination of a lot of ideas sonically that I had been approaching for a long time. And I think I've kind of identified more about what I would like to do in the future. But what I have done with this album, I think, is reaching a certain conclusion about how things can kind of come together. And there's a bottomless depth to sonic production and what you can put together. So, but I think with this album, I've kind of been challenged so far as being like a maximalist, and I think I'm always trying to get away from that, but still stay true to the sort of sonic vision I might have in my head. I'm always limited by the actual like physics of reality, of sound, of how things can happen. So I think there are like a lot of layers, like a lot of guitars, a lot of synthesizers, a lot of like vocals being stacked. And I think that's the album I wanted to make, because that's kind of how I demoed it out. That's what I had envisioned. But I think I got to sort of the conclusion of something that I started long ago. And so I'm not sure where I will go next, but I mean, I have been working on more music, and I think my maximalist tendencies have remained, but I think that there's different ideas I have now about how to put them all together and to kind of give everything its own space a little more, which I don't know, isn't to say anything bad. I think we made a pretty good sounding album, and I certainly tried very hard, and I put Elijah through a lot of work and can't thank him enough for helping me to see the vision through and to kind of offer his own insight. And then of course the other band members threw their hat in the ring in that regard as well. And I think for my own growth and for my own learning and how to put things together, it's just kind of interesting, because I started these songs like 5 years ago or more, even on some of them, like recording the demos, and I guess I always sort of had this idea of how they would come together, and we did our best to make that a reality. I think now that I've grown in the last 5 years, I have new ideas about how things should come together and what should and shouldn't happen at the same time in terms of like a sonic frequency spectrum. And so I think we did the best we possibly could. I think it was a very tall order that I gave Elijah, but it's very stacked, and I think this would be something I'm curious to ask you about, because like I'm almost like, I don't know, is it exhausting to listen to? That's what I worry about, because it's very dense. There's a lot of shit going on at the same time, always.
It's not exhausting.
Okay.
But I do understand why you're asking whether it is.
Sure.
Because there is this density, there is a lot going on. And I think that that fits in ways that we'll probably be able to recognize as we engage with some of the lyrics and the details of some of the specific songs. I think that this density and this moments where, you know, there's a kind of sense of like the onslaught. It's not a bad experience, it's a coherent experience.
Okay. Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, just speaking objectively, and I'm not even like trying to fish for compliments. I have my own feelings about it. It's just strange. I mean, and that's kind of what I'm saying is that like I got so close to it. I've worked with it for like so long, and you know, I think there's moments where the clouds break and I can see a sunbeam and I say, oh yeah, I think that was pretty good. I think we made something pretty good. But also like I'm a perfectionist. I'm very hard on myself, and so it's kind of hard for me to know what it even is, what it even sounds like. Is it even music? Are these even songs? Is this even art, I guess?
Yes,
Is this just like a onslaught of sound waves? Is it just, yeah, but it sounds like it's coherent.
it is.
Good.
Yes, it's
okay.
coherent. It fits with the and I think that there is in particular a coherent conversation between what these songs are saying thematically, like through the lyrics, and how they sound. And I think that's
okay. Sweet.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, that's I like to dwell on this question because I mean these are things I've been considering for my own part, because it's kind of like project management in a sense.
Yeah.
In a certain sense, it more became that than like an actual work, and it still is that actual work, quite obviously. But my perspective has had to shift between those kind of modes because these songs, like I said, were started like 5 years ago, and I'm basically a very different, not very different person. I'm still the same person, but like I can't always instantly be in touch with the Michael of 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. So it's like I'm seeing this guy's vision through like, are you sure this is what you wanted? Okay, let's do it. That's what you wanted. And I think he'd be happy. I think he'd be very happy with how it turned out. But yeah, I'm just like,
I know him. I think he'd be happy.
Okay, cool, yeah. Because I was seeing that guy's vision through. I think we succeeded. So that's great.
And that's the way in which we're talking about it is interesting. Like, because thematically, the idea of the reckoning with certain patterns and the exorcism of the cycles of habit. Obviously, if present Michael is someone who has that commitment and has been cultivating that commitment over the course of years, it's really interesting to think of honoring the vision of 5 years. Is quite a lot happens in 5 years. Yeah. Especially if you're committed to, if you're like intentional in that way about recalibrating. So I think that's I like this kind of long intro where we're kind of thinking about honoring that vision, but that vision is also a vision of exorcism. It's quite complex. Before we dive into the first song, the title of the band, Jeweler, one thing that it brought to mind for me was a statement by Tom Waits, who realized that as a songwriter, the only thing I really do is make jewelry for the inside of other people's minds. So that's a Tom Waits quote. So that's interesting on the back of, again, what we were just saying. I think that's a helpful metaphor to think about what music is. And Tom Waits was using that metaphor to counter his own perfectionism, which is something else that we were just talking about. He's like, well, basically it is just jewelry, for the inside. He's kind of trying to step a little bit more into humility about what it is to make music. I encountered that statement from him in a book called Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. And she basically introduces that statement to then move on to a subsection called the central paradox, where she's proposing as a creative, holding on to these two paradoxical ideas. My creative expression must be the most important thing in the world to me if I am to live artistically, and it must not matter at all if I am to live sanely, she said. So, and then like the idea, I'm just making jewelry for someone else's mind, then we can kind of, that helps us, not get too kind of caught up in the perfectionism. But at the same time, making jewelry for another person's mind seems like a pretty important job to me. So what is the significance of you could take this one or two ways. What's your sense of the significance of the band name? And you can completely ignore everything that I just said, or what do you think about this idea of intercranial jewelry making, is how Elizabeth Gilbert summarized it.
I think I like that Tom Waits quote quite a bit. That's actually the first I've heard it, and I think I'm going to go ahead and pretend that that's the inspiration for the band name.
You can take it.
Yeah, thanks. Because I mean, I think maybe the motivation for that name is similar. Dylan was actually the one who came up with it, and I think the main story on that is the band was called Michael, and I think I still might release something under that mononym at some point. But I think at best, having a band called Michael is not very Googleable. And at worst, it obscures the contributions from the other band members. So I think it's appropriate to be in a band. And our band is called Jeweler. I think it is distinctive, and I think it is Googleable. So it works for me. I think the intention is kind of similar to that Tom Waits quote, in that you are crafting these jewels and presenting them to people. Here you go, another jewel.